Okay, I wanted to share with you an approach that seems to have made a bit of a difference to some of our students' essays, particularly at the top end, and it's for paper 2 of Edexcel English Literature. We do Atonement and Hard Times, and maybe it's just specific to these texts, or maybe there's something to be learnt for all texts, I don't really know. We were finding that students were tending to compare the text by particular characters, so that say Emily Tallis and Mrs Gradgrind are both weak women, and here's some evidence and here's some context, and the points were fine but kind of limited. I seemed to struggle to sort of get to the heart of really what the authors were trying to do and what was the overall point of each text. So we teach it a little bit more through diagrams that try and sum up, what is the author actually trying to achieve, and how can we sum up the overall structure and the overall point of this book in that form. So I'm going to draw 3 diagrams and just talk you through how this might help you structure your essay slightly differently. So excuse the terrible handwriting if I put HT there for Hard Times and a tone there for Atonement. And I'm going to draw 3 things. The first one is that, the second one is that and that, and the third one, and this is where the picture gets really interesting, is that and this. Okay, so you may not be able to tell the artwork isn't particularly brilliant, but what it is meant to show is an arrow and a circle, then an exclamation mark and a question mark, and then a microscope and a picture of a globe or the world. I think these 3 comparison images really sum up what the authors are trying to do, and if you want a kind of overriding point for almost any theme at all, these will help you to do it. So firstly, Hard Times is an arrow. It's a chronological book. It gives us a clear moral. It gives us clear cause and effect. It follows children who grow into adults and shows the problems. The book titles are sowing, reaping, garnering. So sowing would be done in spring, reaping in summer, garnering in autumn. Everything about this book is a line. It's an arrow. It takes us on a journey. And even at the end, Dickens ends with "Dear Reader." He tells the reader what to do. He's given us a lesson and he wants us to do something about it. So it is a very, very clear cause and effect text, whereas Atonement is a circle. It begins and ends with the trials of Arabella. It actually ends with Bryony planning on redrafting the text. So actually, the very end of this text is her going back to the start and going, actually, I'm going to change it all round. The whole thing is one big circle. There's a point at the end, isn't there, that Cecilia and Robbie are actually dead, but I think the wider point is Bryony sort of telling us that they're not dead, because actually the story says that they're alive, so it doesn't matter what the reality is, and she will just go and rewrite it. So everything about Atonement, they go back to the house at the end. Everything about Atonement is a massive circle. Exclamation mark and question mark. Again, Dickens is very clearly didactic, isn't he? He's got this omniscient narrator. He's not afraid every now and again to speak directly to the reader and tell them what to do. The end, "Dear Reader," is a great example, but there's little bits of moralising about the circus, there's little bits of moralising about church on a Sunday and why it's actually okay to drink. The characters' names aren't particularly subtle. So at the circus you have Kidderminster, Childers, so their names start literally with kid and child. He's making very, very clear points. Dickens often gets some flack for not being very subtle, but that's part of his point. He's this sort of slightly melodramatic author. He's not writing to be subtle, he's writing to give us a very clear message. He's writing to give us caricatures and a very clear sort of social point. McEwan is deliberately doing the opposite. Atonement is one big question mark. Obviously, in the most obvious sense, it's what happens, what doesn't. Where does reality end and fiction begin? There's that question, but he deliberately avoids answers all the way through. At the end, the central point that McEwan makes is, don't be a certain kind of reader who demands the truth. Be the kind of reader who allows the story to be whatever you want it to be. He argues that basically as readers we all just want a happy ending, and that's why Bryony ultimately wants Robbie and Cecilia to get together at the end, because as a child she wanted that in the first place. She wanted the prince and the princess to get together, just like in Trials of Arabella. McEwan challenges all our other notions of realism, because when Bryony looks for realism, actually she gets it wrong and gets things further from the truth. But I guess there's wider questions to be had here, aren't there, as well, about Lola. How far is Lola's depiction accurate, or how far is actually Bryony painting Lola in a certain way to make herself feel better? Same with Paul Marshall. When Lola and Paul are compared to Cruella de Vil at the end, or she's a racing dog as well, isn't she? How far is that an accurate depiction, or how far is McEwan playing with our ideas and our perceptions of reality, because that's how Bryony sees them? So the whole text is a big, big question mark. The readers are complicit in the lie. The whole point of Atonement is we want the fiction. Think about the scene with Luke Cornett in the hospital. Luke Cornett says to Bryony, did they get married at the end? He's got a brain injury, and he thinks that he knows, when he thinks that he knows Cecilia and Robbie, but still he goes back to this childlike state and says, is there a happy ending? And that's what McEwan gives us, but he draws our attention to the fact that it's not really real. And then finally, the microscope and the world. Essentially what I'm trying to do there is show how Dickens uses microcosm and McEwan uses macrocosm. So Dickens uses microcosm in the sense of using small things, individuals, to represent big social points. So the hand's the most obvious example. If you ever Google metonymy, the hands in Hard Times are always what is used. So where a part represents a whole, they are hands. They are a part of the body, but that's all they're kind of good for in this society. So that's why they are just known as the hands. Dickens shines a light on really specific characters, the Gradgrind children, Stephen Blackpool, who represent wider social points. The Gradgrind children representing the problems with a utilitarian education, Stephen Blackpool represents a much wider point about social injustice and a utilitarian workforce. So it's individuals representing a wider social point. McEwan does almost exactly the opposite. McEwan uses macrocosm. In other words, he uses these big global events like World War II, like the breakdown of the class system, I guess, like the changes in society when we look at the end of the text, how society has changed to the 90s, to actually represent one person's guilt, isn't it? The whole text, we get at the end, the question, did everything have to be, in fact I think it might be in part 2, did everything have to be Bryony's fault? Couldn't some of it be the war's fault instead? These big global events essentially represent Bryony's guilt in this story, because she is the one who's created the story. She is the author, she's also God, and that's the point that's made in the epilogue. So these big global events are essentially just a metaphor for what Bryony has done wrong. The breakdown of innocence caused by World War II is a metaphor for the breakdown of innocence that Bryony has caused. So it's macrocosm, actually, McEwan using big events to represent one person's guilt. So in terms of how we could approach this, entrapment is a common question. A lot of second years did that in the mock, and just found lots of entrapment. This model could work incredibly well. So what some students did was they looked at the idea of entrapment with Hard Times with this line versus circle approach, that actually one particularly good essay made the point that Dickens sets the reader free at the end, that this is a big line where ultimately the whole point of the text is to stop entrapment. The reader is free to make a change, whereas Atonement, actually, we are trapped at the end. By the end of the book, we go back to the start, we go back to Trials of Arabella, we're questioning what really happened. Similarly, entrapment with the exclamation mark versus the question mark, people could have argued that actually what Dickens is trying to do in Hard Times is give us a very, very clear moral about entrapment. These children are trapped and it can never be put right in the world of the book. McEwan makes entrapment a far more tricky and complex question. For example, how far are Bryony and Cecilia trapped? Robbie and Cecilia trapped. One of their first encounters is in a library. Well, then they're trapped in the pages of text, and even when they're writing to each other, they use characters as code. So McEwan sort of, I guess, makes us question here the nature of entrapment. He also makes us question how far are we complicit in the entrapment? How far do we, like Luke Cornett, just want the happy ending, and we don't care if it's real or not? And in terms of microcosm versus macrocosm, you could look here where Dickens shines a light on very, very small instances of entrapment. Stephen Blackpool in The Mine Shaft would be a great example. That's a metaphor for a much wider entrapment of a whole class of people. Similarly, Louisa's, her own entrapment, her inability, the fire breaks out, I guess, her own guarded nature that represents a wider point about women, about society. McEwan uses macrocosm here. So, I guess the entrapment at Dunkirk, it's a big, big entrapment of all sorts of different people stuck on the beach. But that represents essentially Bryony desperately trying to get Robbie home to Cecilia, trying to put her sins right, and the fact that she can't do it. So this big massacre of many, many people actually really is just a metaphor for Bryony's inability to put things right. So you could look at it through these ways, and it allows you, I think, to see the novels more conceptually, see the bigger picture, see the overall structure, see the author's points, rather than just picking odd bits, here and there. If I think about another question that has come up in the past, I guess another one would be different points of view. How do they show different points of view? Again, hopefully what these do is they allow you to zoom that out to the reader rather than getting bogged down in individual characters who have different points of view. It's thinking about, well, where does the reader fit in this? So, you could argue that through being a line, Hard Times actually gives us one very, very clear point of view, and ultimately Dickens doesn't really give us much of an idea about how to put things right, but he gives us a very clear message to put them right. The reader has a very distinct point of view. Yes, Dickens uses different points of view in the text, but really they're caricatures. He is giving us one clear point of view, whereas Atonement, the whole point is that we almost need to go back to the start and reread it at the end. Ultimately, we take on a childish point of view at the end, just like Bryony did at the start. So ultimately, actually, we choose a point of view. We choose what point of view to take, and ultimately, McEwan argues we all go with childhood. We all go with innocence. Exclamation mark, question mark. I guess in terms of different points of view, it's a variation on the same point I just made, really, isn't it? But Dickens being ultimately didactic, says, dear reader, he tells us what to think. He controls our point of view, we could argue. He tells us what we should think here. He tells us what we need to do. McEwan does not give us a point of view at all. He asks us a question about what sort of ending we want. So he invites us as readers to take our own point of view. We choose what happens to Bryony, to Cecilia, and particularly to Robbie. He gives us that choice. He pulls the rug from under our feet and ultimately argues that in a story we are as complicit as Bryony is. We can't have the cop out of going what really happened, because you're saying, well, you choose what really happened. Microcosm versus macrocosm, I guess you could argue, surely couldn't you, that Dickens zooms in on very specific points of view but to make a wider point about society. So the Gradgrind versus Sissy, he's given us a very, very clear choice here through those two characters in what we need to do, and through weakening Gradgrind and strengthening Sissy as the novel goes on. Sissy's associated with sunlight. Gradgrind is literally worn down. He stops being quite sort of square. It's like he's been sort of bits of him been shaved away. Through doing that, Dickens gives us a very clear message about whose side he's on. You could argue that we've got Sissy versus Harthouse as well. You could argue you get Bounderby as well as his clear point of view. But Dickens uses these very specific characters to give a clear point to the reader. Our perspective, how we look at them, should very clearly be through this lens of seeing that certain characters as right and certain characters as wrong. Atonement is this massive macrocosm where, could we not argue that actually we don't get anyone else's point of view other than Bryony's? Everything else in this big book, this big macrocosmic book, is really just about Bryony's mistake. Could you not argue ultimately that there are no points of view? Every other point of view is a fallacy, really, because ultimately this is Bryony's text. She controls it. So Lola, we could see Lola in multiple different ways, but how far is that controlled by Bryony? And is that Luke Cornet scene really just proof that Bryony in her head has decided to go a certain way and is actually controlling how we see everything else? We get the appearance of an omniscient narrator at first, where we see all the characters' feelings, we see what Cecilia thinks, what Paul thinks, what Robbie thinks, but really in Atonement all of those things are simply coming through the lens of Bryony and her own imagination. And Atonement ends with that point of view really fracturing, where Bryony is sort of losing her mind and says go back to the start. So could we argue that the reader then inhabits that point of view, that actually the reader has been primed to take on sort of Bryony's role and create the story in our minds that we want? So two questions that often were answered in quite a pedestrian way, by picking out entrapment or by picking out points of view. I think looking at those three images allows you to make more interesting points about the overall structure of the text, the overall writer's point, and the role of the reader. And I think as long as you're starting to do that, you're pushing into a more interesting, more metalinguistic or metafictional level.